I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Meghan Burke is Associate Professor of Sociology at Illinois Wesleyan University, where her areas of specialty are social theory and race. Meghan is the author of 3 books: Racial Ambivalence in Diverse Communities, Whiteness and the Power of Colorblind Ideologies, Race, Gender, and Class in the Tea Party, What the Movement Reflects About Mainstream Ideologies, and most recently, her book, Colorblind Racism. On her campus, Meghan co-developed and directs the Engaging Diversity Pre-Orientation Program, a 3-day intensive program for incoming white students to deeply consider white privilege and anti-racism so that they can work as partners for social and racial justice. This program has been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed. Dr. Burke was also named 2013 Professor of the Year and 2016 Advisor of the Year by IWU students, and among NerdWallet's 40 under 40 professors who inspire. I give you Dr. Meghan Burke.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? I hope you're feeling excited for the work that you're going to be doing over the next day and a half here. Excitement isn't always the feeling that first comes to mind for folks in these challenges and in these efforts. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if I surveyed the room. I'm a sociologist, so we're social scientists. We like surveys, and found a lot of you who maybe were feeling kind of anxious, kind of uncomfortable about how these conversations might go, having to grapple with some uncomfortable truths, particularly if you're white like me and have to own some of the unearned privileges that shape our daily lives, sometimes without our awareness. I also wouldn't be surprised if some of you are feeling exhausted, who have been in a number of conversations and efforts like these many times over and haven't always seen, as it's rare for us to see, the exact kind of outcomes that we might hope for, and are really navigating perhaps some racial battle fatigue. And so I want to commend all of you, no matter where you sit, and that isn't necessarily dependent on who you are, but it might be, across that spectrum, for showing up for this summit, for showing up for racial justice and equity, and showing up as educators and as students to try to make meaningful impact in your community, on your campuses, in your schools. I am hopeful to talk for just about 40 minutes or so. We really wanted to be sure to leave time for some Q&A. And part of what I want to do before I get going is to just give you a little bit of context about who I am. I appreciate the kind introduction and all of the warm reception that I've received from the fantastic folks here at ICC and in Peoria already so far. But I want you to kind of understand the lens to which I come at this work. I'm also going to talk just very briefly about some of my own scholarship prior to the Colorblind Racism book. I'm hopeful that that can give you some practical examples to kind of get your head around what the heck does this mean, how might this show up in various kinds of communities. And then talk just briefly about that diversity program that I do on my campus, with the hope that it might inspire some possibilities, right? We don't have it all figured out. I want to be sure to say that out of the gates. I certainly don't, but I have some things that I can offer as you begin your work here for the next day and a half. Then I'll talk about colorblind racism itself, though you'll hear hints of that before I get going, why I think it matters for us to start with that as a premise and start with that as a framework, and then just some notes and some thoughts to begin the dialogue that I know your amazing facilitators are going to be helping you with over the next day and a half here. So I'm a sociologist. I was really thrilled in that video to, well, also saddened to hear that those wonderful high school students students hadn't necessarily felt like they were able to learn about the society where we spend our entire lives. And so sociologists, that's a big part of what we do. Sociologists really we're social scientists who study patterned human behavior. And we're especially interested in the big issues like power and studying inequalities, looking carefully and critically and meaningfully at institutions and ideologies, and how we navigate our lives and how we also work to impact those same systems. So sociologists, it's not as though we're not interested in individuals, but we look at the big picture and the large social forces that shape our lives, but then also how we work to continue to make and remake those institutions, those power systems, those value systems, those cultures, those climates, all of those things, because we are active agents in this process and not just passive recipients of socialization. And racism, unfortunately, right, though I suspect you wouldn't be in the room if you totally didn't believe that this was the case, right? Racism remains central in those social forces that shape our lives, that shape our opportunities, that shape then how we show up in the world and our identities and our communities, and shape then the possibilities that we hold as a community in our schools, and that while it is still continuing to produce dramatically unequal outcomes by race and other social factors as well, but again, race is absolutely central to that there are leverage points for change. And so as a sociologist, this is what I'm passionate about, this is what I'm interested in, this is what I study. And this also is the landscape in which we navigate a really tricky dynamic. And so I'll give you like a little bit more of a formal definition of colorblind racism a little bit later, but the hardest thing I think that we often have to navigate these days is that we do all of this work and we do all of this thinking and we try to create these action plans despite the reality that most of us like to think of racism as only about individual prejudice, individual bias, that then therefore means that racism is just about those bad people with those bad ideas, doing those bad things. And notice even my body language as I say those things. Most of us will think, well, that's not me, right? And we're still thinking so much at that individual level that we're not analyzing the institutions that surround us and the systemic level of racism. So racism is a system of advantage and disadvantage, right, based on race, and connects up deeply to other social systems as well. So that's my lens as a sociologist. That's the framework for the comments that I'm going to be making with you here today. I promise to keep this brief, but I'm hopeful that it gives some examples. So thanks to Dr. Ali, who shared with you the titles of my previous two books. And I want to just give you those examples, like I say, just in part so that you can get your head around, like, what the heck does this mean? How does this show up? But also to make what I think is a central point, because as you'll hear, I talk to folks across the political spectrum, and across spectrums that are either really homogenous and really diverse. And I found very, very similar ways of operating with regard to the realities of racism in our society. So my first book, that's called Racial Ambivalence in Diverse Communities, this was about stably racially diverse neighborhoods in Chicago. And so these happen to be on the far northeast side. They're rare, actually. So while we talk a lot about the growing diversity, let's say in the United States, and sometimes there's chatter about, well, when will white folks like me become part of the minority numerically and all of that, we still have today not only strong but rising levels of racial segregation in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our schools. And so segregation is still the norm. When we have diversity, it often tends to operate as a flashpoint in transition, right? As a neighborhood may go from white to Latino or black to white or whatever it might be. But there are some communities around the country that get diverse and stay diverse for a couple decades. And so I was fascinated. Broadly, as a sociologist, I'm interested in the ways that people talk and think about race, and then how that then impacts, how that shows up in the work that they do in their spheres of influence. And so I was fascinated to study these racially diverse communities in Chicago that are also proudly liberal. They claim a progressive politics as part of their neighborhood identity, as part of their community identity, and often for many folks within it as part of their personal identities. And so the question was like, well, what's different there? And the answer was not much, right? That folks still in those spaces tend to operate with a colorblind lens, that wanted to minimize the significance of race, that white folks who were disproportionately in positions of power, even in those racially diverse communities, despite the fact that not everyone, of course, wanted that to be the case, still were able to create comfort, protection, privileges, and a hoarding of resources for themselves, for their families, for their own well-being within that community. Okay, so talk about an uncomfortable truth, right? And there's a lot more to that book. I'd be happy to share some more with you if you're interested. They've got articles and things. You're welcome to email me. That way you don't have to buy the book. But so that's a little bit about what that first study was about. Well, then I moved to Central Illinois. I live in Bloomington. I work at Illinois Wesleyan University, and this happened around the time that the Tea Party was gaining prominence. So Tea Party, as I think most of you know, is a far-right, conservative political movement that was prominent during the years that I studied at around 2010-ish, right after the beginning of the recession, and then lasted for a couple of years, really kind of up until the midterm elections in Obama's first term. And folks got really mobilized to try to shape their communities in ways that they were, in response to things they were unhappy with. They got a lot of, I think, entirely fair criticism for what were actually some isolated examples of overt racism, which breaks the rules. Okay, colorblind racism is the norm, right? We're not really supposed to be overtly racist these days any longer. Typically, instead, it's coded, it's colorblind, it's polite, it's gentle, it's still insidious, right? But I thought, well, gosh, I study how people talk and think about race and how that shapes the work that they do. And so I interviewed Tea Party organizers throughout the state of Illinois, the most prominent folks in pockets all over the state, and asked similar kinds of questions, like what brought you to this movement? Why is this the space where you got involved? And there were some neat things happening. A lot of women became involved in politics for the first time in their lives as a part of this movement, and I found that fascinating. A lot of older folks as well, kind of owning power in their communities that they had found lacking before. But it was mostly the same kind of thing, right? So while I think any criticism of expressions of racism is fair, and therefore I think those criticisms are fair with respect to the Tea Party, it was still mostly the coded colorblind stuff. Right? And so I argue that the Tea Party form of racism, or what we might say today, the Trump form of racism, is American racism. Okay? And that's the kind of stuff that my work covers more broadly. So after that, I was able to step back and write this book, Colorblind Racism, which was the impetus for my invitation with you here today. This book is the first of its kind to really look broadly at a wide body of research on colorblind racism. There really hadn't been. We found a treatise that really looks at, like, okay, well, where have we been in this, what is sometimes called this new form of racism? What have we learned? What have we not learned? I think that's an important piece of the puzzle there. And how might that matter for our thinking, our scholarship, our conversations around race? So there's lots of questions kind of interspersed throughout. And I just want to say that I do have discount flyers. Academics do not make money on these books, so I promise I'm not trying to hawk them, but if you do become interested, there's a discount that my publisher was generous enough to make available. So colorblind racism is what I study. It's what I try not to do, but it's what I talk about a lot. So that's the framework here. I also, as Dr. Ali mentioned, I do some work on my own campus. This work, it sounds really funny at first. It's the all-white diversity program, which could be really creepy. But so there's, I think, for good reason, sometimes eyebrows raised about that. But and it was the brainchild. I'm always intentional about giving her credit of my friend and colleague, Dr. Kira Banks, who's now down at St. Louis University. She's a psychology professor. She and I, when we shared a few years on campus before she moved to another institution, found that we had a lot of shared interests in our teaching, in our research, and became friends. And she came to me one day and she said, I want to do this weird thing. I want to do some intentional work with the white students on our campus, because on a predominantly white campus, those are the folks who have a lot of impact, not the only impact, but have a lot of impact on the climate. And like a lot of campuses, like a lot of schools, like a lot of communities, we really want to positively impact the climate for everyone, but particularly to improve the experiences of students of color who we know have a lot more pain, a lot more challenges on our campus. And those challenges have nothing to do with their capabilities and their strengths, but rather have to do with the climate, right? Whether it's microaggressions, whether it's still some systemic issues. And so we thought, okay, why don't we pull in and do some caucus work with the white students on our campus? A lot of that is about kind of getting folks over the hurdle of colorblindness, because that sounds like the nice, polite thing. Oh, I don't see race. I don't, I'm not a racist, but like recognizing that we all hold biases and starting from that truth and working from there. And then really kind of learning about systemic institutional racism, thinking about how that shows up on our campus, and then trying to think about how to do meaningful ally work. So there's a lot of caucus work. That's how you can see at the sort of tables there. But then we also have partnered activities to help try to build some bridges and some early friendships with the other students who are also there for what we call PRIOs, the pre-orientation programs, which are domestic students of color, for whom it's an optional program just like ours, and then for international students. So if there are questions or thoughts about that either now, or you're always welcome to email me. I love to share resources about what we've tried, what works, what doesn't. We're always changing it, but that's part of the work that I do on my campus, kind of beyond my scholarship. So why don't I finally get around to telling you what the heck colorblind racism is? I suspect that many of you already know, right? But let's share a language, let's share a framework with the hope that it can inform the conversations and the action planning and things that you're gonna have moving forward. I think that this cartoon says a lot, right? So one example here is what a lot of us, if we think of traditional racism, old school racism, our heads go to examples like the Klan or the the origin of the Lumina Fund to support this work came from events like Charleston, and we saw just 1 week ago today, has it been a week already, right? The events in Christchurch. So white supremacy as an overt, intentional, that's where most of us think about racism. And then we think, well, then everybody else is somehow in this other camp. But as you can see up here, right? Here you have a depiction of a Klansperson, at least I'm aware of my prejudice, as opposed to what the author labeled the colorblind racist that says, well, if I can't see your color, then I can't judge you. Which of course, when it's put like that, we understand that it's naive. But because that's so actively socialized to be the way that we talk and think and learn about and teach each other about racism, that becomes the default practice. So I always also want to point out, and I was really thrilled to see, lots of books available out there, including, I think I saw Eduardo Bonilla Silva's. His is probably the most famous book about this. It's called Racism Without Racists, which is a fantastic title to get at this, which that cartoon I just showed you also depicts. I also saw Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book out there. Read that book. Read hers instead of mine. It's amazing. But so there's lots of work around this. The way I like to explain colorblind racism is, as you've been hearing me say, right? These are ways of talking and thinking about race that do a few things, right? One is that it affirms our belief in this cherished American ideal of individualism, right? So it's about if you just work hard, if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that assumes that there are no remaining barriers, that assumes that if there are things like segregation, that it's just, that's just how people are, that those are just preferences, those are circumstances that can be overcome if you just try hard enough, right? And trying hard is absolutely part of the game. Anyone who's marginalized knows that and will tell you that, but that's not all there is to the story, because that's not enough, right? But colorblind racism, the way we talk and the way we think, doesn't let us know that, right? Another thing that colorblind racism does is that it tends to affirm, and I always like, maybe this shouldn't even be in parentheses, but I always like to insert that it affirms our belief in these often imagined cultural differences. Not that they're not cultural differences. Okay, the video that we watched spoke beautifully to some of that as well. Right? But I love the quote by Claudia Rankine, who wrote Citizen and many other powerful poems and pieces of art about racism and many other important things in our society. She says that, for example, blackness in the white imagination has nothing to do with black people. Right? It's the white imagination. Right? And we as white folks, I say this as a white person, don't just kind of come up with this on our own, though that happens sometimes too. I'm sure we've all been in some of those conversations. These are deeply controlling images that we are socialized and re-socialized over and over again because of choices that are made in our very limited portrayals in the media and our very narrow political discourse in a whole host of other things that teach us and reteach us these problematic racial stereotypes. Right? So we're still leaning on those, even if the language isn't always as overt. And then, of course, it also doesn't recognize the many remaining barriers to equality. So this chart up here from the Brookings Institute, I apologize for the smaller font, it actually captures some of the loss of wealth after the recession. So white wealth is on top, black wealth is on bottom. There's lots of other data out there that speak to other racial groups, so I know that it's limited by only focusing on those two groups. But even post-recession, right, whites still come out far ahead in terms of wealth, right? Wealth is a primary, not the only, but a primary legacy of the racial inequality that has been built into our society and into this country from really day one. Right? When we said you had to be white to be a citizen, you had to be white to own property, that if you were not white, could be property, that then your access to homes and home equity that you pass on to your kids, that shapes the funding for your schools, right? Those are all mechanisms that exist and are out there in our society that most of us don't want, but a lot of us also won't give up. And I think that's an uncomfortable truth as well in terms of that intergenerational transmission of wealth and protections and privileges for our families. But that's one of these barriers, right? But we say, nope, all good, anything but race, anything but racism, racism but no racists, okay? So that's colorblind racism. I think I've given you a lot of examples, but just to talk about how this shows up in discourse. I'm not racist. In fact, I work with a very successful black man, and he's great. I'm sure he is, but hey, it's not about you, and that's tokenizing, and right, that's a great example of colorblind racism. It's my grandparents' generation who are the racists. Today, anyone can make it if they try hard enough, right? Lots of fantastic grandparents out there. Let's give them credit. I don't know that they only are the ones deserving of that blame, but studies continue to find that kids, even before going to kindergarten, and certainly throughout, right, and college students, I mean, I love the young people we saw in this video. I already love the young people who are here today. I'm really excited that there are students in the room, but ask any of them and they'll tell you, it's not as though racism is absent in the younger generation, because it's what we're taught, it's what we teach each other, it's what we reproduce. I don't understand why people play the race card. Asian families seem to do just fine, and it's because they teach their kids the right values, right? Totally ignoring that prior to just the last generation or so, just a few decades ago, right, was the first moment where we actually granted access to Asians. We'd had the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was such fear and anxiety that the presence of Asians in this country would inherently dumb down the population. This was eugenics thinking, right, that they were barbaric, that they were stupid. I mean, terrible racial stereotypes for Asians. I always say to my students, Asians didn't change, right? Any more than any culture, of course, is always in process, right? It's our laws and our policies that changed, right? This is a way the model minority stereotype is unfair and harmful to Asians, but it's also used as a political weapon against those who don't have those same opportunities. And of course, all lives matter. So why does colorblind racism matter? In short, colorblind racism is the language of contemporary racism, by and large. That's not to say that there are not some clearly racist expressions of racism that we hear from the top office to the ordinary person on the street in this country. Of course that still happens, and there's a little bit of a danger in that our focus sometimes on colorblind racism ignores that old school racism is still alive and well, but for most folks, it's this colorblind paradigm. And that makes it more difficult to detect and easier to defend and uphold. And I want to talk about how that happens in a few specific ways. First, of course, it's embedded in our institutions and in our ideologies. So ideologies are set ways of thinking and understanding the world that come to be common sense to us, right? So things like the idea that the civil rights movement, which at the time was called the freedom movement of the 1950s and 1960s, fixed everything. King gave this great speech. We only listened to the last third of it where he tells us all to get along, and the first 2/3 where he's talking about police brutality and housing segregation, but he told us and now we're good, right? Of course we know that that's not true, but we act as though that's true. Right? And it's embedded, as I've said, and I'll continue to talk about in our institutions. It's also often coded, right? There's a great political scientist, Ian Haney-Lopez, who's written a few fantastic books about race. I definitely recommend you checking them out. I think his most recent one, certainly one I'm referring to here, is called Dog Whistle Politics. I have a dog. I don't have a whistle for her. But for those of you that don't know dog whistles, you can kind of hear them to the human ear, but dogs definitely hear them, right? So it's about how messages get communicated to an intended audience without being easily detectable, right? This provides plausible deniability. Right? I'm just saying those people. If you're inferring that I'm talking about poor people of color, well, then you must be racist. Right? Or referring to ghetto, right? Or referring to illegal, not for specific acts. And sorry to the police officers in the room that will be the first to know this. We all commit, right, illegal acts sometimes. I'm a jaywalk or something, right? That's an illegal act. But referring to people as illegal, and often if I say illegal immigrants, right? If I break a norm that I don't like to reproduce by referring to human beings as illegal, you probably have a pretty specific images of who that means. But if I call you on that, it's like, oh, that must be what you think, right? So that's coded racism. And it's sometimes or often couched in either polite or sometimes even I just wrote an article about what I called sympathetic racism, which is racism. It's paternalistic, right? But so polite, you're just, that neighborhood is sketchy, right? Most folks know what that means, and racialized notions and stereotypes and inferences are often built into that. Or it's a shame what nonsense goes on at home with these kids, right, in these poor schools and these poor communities. Oh, I just wish it wasn't that way. Right? Wishing it wasn't that way is fine, right? But sort of attributing it to, again, often imagined family values or practices or differences in culture. That's where we get into the colorblind racism stuff. And again, I want to emphasize that this is polite for white folks like me, to keep us comfortable, to keep us protected, to keep us off the hook. And instead, I think we need to lean into it and be on the hook. Centrally, it ignores the identities and the experiences of people of color, whose experiences in life, while they will vary, so it's not as though, again, most of you know this, but it has to be said because we act as though we forget, and I think many of us do forget this sometimes in our public life in this country, right? That your racial identity, just like your gender identity, is not going to automatically mean that you think the same way or you have the same experiences, but patterns show up, right? These identities that matter to us matter because they matter to other people. In erasing those experiences, erasing that lived truth, erasing that wisdom and experience is erasing a central part, not only of that side of things, but then also the pride and resilience and strength and community that grows up around that, right? Pride movements, power movements are often talking back to those systems in society that have tried to diminish people on the basis of those identities. Same thing, lots of folks talk about like, oh, well, I don't see you as whatever person of color, as though that's a bad thing, right? Also, are you blind? I mean, this is not how it works, but I think our anxieties around these uncomfortable truths of race and racism in our society. Speaking of uncomfortable truths, okay, and if you can't read the text, of course, the large text ignores the realities of historical and institutional racism, and I think it's powerful that this cartoonist has talked, so in the upper quadrant, we have white neighborhoods going around the clock, white schools, minority neighborhood, minority schools, and we see gates, we see walls, okay, that speaks to that ongoing segregation that is so persistent and in fact growing. It's one of the most depressing truths. I don't know why people ever let me talk to them. I bum people out for a living, right? But folks know, right, that we have not only persistent but growing racial inequality. So we're at the levels that are similar or a bit beyond by some measures where we were at the beginning of the freedom movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. We have a lot of serious work to do, and you're here because you know that, and you're here because you're going to help. As I've mentioned already, this also protects the comfort and the privileges for white folks. Too often, and again, please go read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, right? Too often, we pivot toward the protection of the feelings and the comfort of white people like me over the lives, and certainly the livelihood, and the work that's needed to lift up and sustain and partner with people of color in this nation, in our communities, in our schools, on our campuses. It's to the point where being labeled racist is among white folks' greatest fears, whereas surviving interactions with powerful people is among folks of color's greatest fears. I mean, how can you even put those in the same lane? But too often we do. It also keeps us stagnant. It keeps us immature. It keeps us far from where we might need to be in order to do this work. I'm going to say a little bit more about guilt in just a little bit here, but it's not a place to be necessarily. It's certainly not a place to stay. Because I know that I'm speaking to passionate educators who don't want the world to look and feel this way, and because of the students in the room, which I'm really excited about, I want to just briefly talk about some things that I talk about in a little bit more detail in my book. Really, it's just about citing, sourcing the other great studies that have been done about how colorblind racism shows up in schooling, and I'm going to talk a little bit, just very briefly about K-12, very briefly about higher ed, and then I'll go into some notes and thoughts for our conversations moving forward. I also want to provide the caveat that the sociology of education, that's a whole subfield in my discipline, it's not my expertise, but I can share with you some of the work of others, and you are the experts in this room because you're embedded in doing this work on a daily basis. I want to plug the work of my friend and colleague, Lori Cooper-Stoll. She's up in the Wisconsin system somewhere at one of the universities up there. We went to graduate school together. And she's also very interested in colorblind racism, and she specifically works in the context of school. So her first book, Race and Gender in the Classroom, is sharply focused on colorblindness. And then she has a new book coming. It's not out yet, but it'll be out this summer, that asks and attempts to answer the question, should schools be colorblind? Spoiler alert, no. Okay, but I have a quote from her 2013 research here that I'll read to you in case the text is too small. She says that the color and gender-blind classroom is built on the assumption, indeed the stated maxim, that every student can learn and be successful regardless of social location. It's a learning environment that welcomes the celebration of diversity while denying the existence of institutional racism and sexism. So that hope, that first point, when we think about colorblindness as an ideal, yes, beautiful, let's go for that. But we can't go for that unless we're really doing the work of looking seriously at the problems that persist and the experiences of folks who still have to crawl over these barriers. This is not Cooper Stoll's work, but another related piece of work. This person said that silence about race denies students, and I loved because we heard the same thing in the video, denies students the skills they need to talk about race openly and honestly, and the opportunity to think about how racism affects them and their relationships with others. Teachers who believe it's best to be colorblind lose the opportunity to address racial inequality in their classrooms and in their overall school programs. Okay, so it feels like the right instinct, but we've got to work past it. Higher education, insert a photo that's probably in any college catalog, and rightly so, because diversity is a value, and we want people to know that they won't be the only, and we have to do the work to be sure they won't be the only, but I don't know, the backpack, the steps look like a college photo to me. Higher education, okay. Research suggests that white faculty who are mentoring students of color too often use a colorblind approach that also influences their perception the students of color as inferior and less interested in opportunities that lead to success. So there's these insidious assumptions that show up in our work even when we're trying to provide support. And so we really have to check our biases, acknowledge that we have them. We all have them. We're just situated differently in systems of power in order to make meaning of those. Rarely were racism and racist institutional norms explicitly named among the range of plausible reasons for racial differences. So when we look at our data, when we look at how we're doing, we want to immediately run away. It's not because there's racism, right? It's not that there's still an unintentional culture of white supremacy on our campuses and in our communities, right? Anything but racism, right, is that colorblind lens. Any university's silence on issues of racism allows the attitudes and actions of white students to take root and thrive on campus. It's part of why Dr. Banks and I created our program to try to do some intentional work to shift that climate a little bit. And it's been marginally successful, but it's only that. And then Jaya Kumar has found that white students from homogenous racial backgrounds tend to uphold or return to colorblind frameworks post-college. So even if they get some critical education that helps folks to unlearn what they had often learned prior to coming, in this case, to college. She says that folks tend to kind of go back unless they have had significant experiences with diversity in their curriculum or experiences while on campus. And I know her and her work. By significant, she means beyond sort of surface, token, ornamental, multiculturalism. There's value in that, but we have to go deeper. We have to go sharper. We have to build real partnerships. So just in terms of closing comments, I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and your questions, and so excited for you to do the work in the coming days here. I just want to offer a few brief notes to sustain those conversations. I also want to say that maybe I should have said this at the outset so you could boo me right off the stage. I don't have the answer. Can I still talk? But there are answers. And I think that we run the risk sometimes if we think that we're gonna be told this thing that's gonna help us do the things and then it's all gonna be fixed. I would hope we would have done that by now if that were the case. But rather, we all have spheres of influence, and that's good news because we can all work in small but in aggregate, collective, meaningful ways to actually begin to shift. We know that that is how change has always been made, even though we like to focus on big leaders, big movements, but it's really the gritty work of everyday life. And so these are just some notes and some thoughts for things you might consider as you walk forward in this summit. First, just remember that racism is not a binary. There's no switch. If so, I'd go flip it. right? It's not about good or bad people. The racists and the non-racists, we talk about it like it's an infectious disease. Did you get the racism? Right? But rather, and I really like sociologist Joe Fagan. He's written, a lot of relevant books that you might find of interest if you don't already know his work. He kind of borrows on the 12-step model, right? Where alcoholics or addicts, even if they're clean or sober, never say that they're fixed or better. They're recovering constantly to acknowledge that that takes work, that takes attention, that takes process. I think about the language of woke these days. And just earlier today, as I was sitting here, I was like, well, we wake up every day. We also go to sleep again every day. Even being awake, getting woke, right, is always an ongoing process as well, because we get tired again and we have to wake ourselves back up and we have to re-engage and continue to learn. Robin DiAngelo in her book White Fragility says this as well, and this is something that many sociologists and others who are engaged in this work always say, what if we started not from the are we racist or not, is there racism or not, but to ask how and in what ways do I perpetuate racism, right? And then to receive answers to that question with gratitude, because then there's work and growth to be done. You don't stay stuck. You don't stay, one of the bad ones, even though I just used the binary there, right? So to look at it as a process, to recognize that we all have biases, we all have blind spots, but to also recognize that racism is not prejudice, right? So folks of color have prejudice, white folks have prejudice. It's whiteness and systems of white privilege and white people who perpetuate racism, because racism is a system of unequal advantages and disadvantages where whites hold unequal power and access and get the spoils of this racist system. Guilt, if that makes you feel crappy, right? Particularly if you're a white person, but I think that if we're honest about trying to do this work and own our prejudices and our biases, no matter who we are, never mind that we all hold multiple simultaneous social identities other than just race, right? There may be moments where folks might feel kind of crummy, might feel sort of guilty, and I think some of that is okay. Notice what you're feeling. Get curious about what it may be reflecting about some uncomfortable truths about yourself. But don't stay there. And don't focus on you, as weird as that sounds, right? When I feel guilty about something I've actually done, not about just who I am, right? I tend to close up and want to hide and disappear, and that's not going to help, right? Same thing, some other reactions to guilt sometimes are just craziness, and that doesn't help either. Okay. I like, many folks, I know Tim Wise has said a version of this. I tried to look for a quote and I couldn't find one. But, he and many others say that, guilt reflects what you did, or I would add, did not do. Right? Because inaction is just as insidious around racism in many cases than action. But responsibility is something you can take because of who you are. You're someone with values that want to walk away from colorblindness and into racial justice and equity, right? You can live a different kind of integrity, and that kind of commitment is what's necessary. Effects matter more than intentions. It's not that intentions don't matter, but if we focus only on intentions, we're going to stay stuck. Actual final thoughts here. I really like, and I was sort of pleased to see, knowing I had already put this together, that sometimes folks are like, okay, well, colorblindness is bad, I get that, so what's the opposite of that, right? And some folks call it racial literacy, like the students in the film that we watched together, sometimes racial cognizance. So if you're looking for a different language, I think that's useful language, but I'm actually going to argue that it's not the goal, right? Our goal should be humility. I love this emerging framework of cultural humility. It's like the recovering process that I talked about from Fagan's sort of appropriation of 12-step language. It's ongoing. You don't get woke and stay woke. You don't become a non-racist. You have to work at constantly being an active anti-racist, right? So humility, recognizing that it's a never finished process. At the end of this, I hope this is true, Dr. Ali, you're not gonna walk out with a badge with like the Get Out of Racism free card, right? I went to the summit, I'm good. Right? But it's an ongoing work of humility, service, and love. And of course, Cornell West, what I mean by love is not that Valentine's Day sort of, right? But justice is what love looks like in public. And even if you are not here because you're passionate about thinking about the complexities of race and the realities of racism, maybe there are other kinds of things that are more excite and energize you around oppression and inequality. Just remember that they're all connected. Okay, and while I do believe that race is vital and central, this is not meant to flatten and just put racism on just like a washed out playing field here. But chiseling it one, you're gonna have to grapple with racism, and it's gonna help to chisel away the whole. Racism is why we can't have nice things. I want that to be the title of my next book. I'm gonna say it out loud here, right? And so if we want nice things, whatever that looks like for our hopes, for our society, for our community, for our schools, for ourselves, for our future, we have to grapple with the realities of racism. Thank you, and I really am eager to hear the questions that you have. I see one over there. Hi.
Hello. Thank you for your work. My question is kind of twofold, but I wanted to know, as I was listening, what experiences or what just inspired you to do this? Because it seems like you had a history of developing into this, so I wanted to know that. And then I also wanted to know, how do you handle, I guess, opposition or conflict?
Yeah, with me doing that work or just
Yes.
in general?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for asking both of those questions. I think the second one especially is really important. In terms of my own history with this, I mean, I grew up in a community that's sort of diverse, but it's also segregated within that community. I grew up in kind of a small town in Michigan, and so I didn't get the kind of education in my own K-12 that the students in the video were talking about. And it wasn't really until graduate school where I got the most meaningful course on race, and taught by a professor, Emily Ignacio, and I had this moment where I was sort of pissed, but not upset in a way of feeling as though I were being attacked, but it's like, how come no one really told me, or how come I wasn't yet poised to listen? And once I was lucky enough to have received that education, I couldn't let it go. It's like, oh my God, like, let's look at this, let's study this. In terms of my own self doing this work and how I navigate some pushback on that, it's never easy, but I think that we have to approach that with, I say we as white folks, right? And so I as a white person have to approach that with gratitude and respect, and acknowledge that while I can be an expert in an academic way, that the real experts in navigating the realities of racism are not white people, but rather people of color. And so to trust the feedback that I hear, and to not run away at the first person that pokes back at me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have a question, you can raise your hand, and the mic will come to you.
I think the one statement I appreciated the most that you said was that inaction is just as insidious as action. And I want to know from your perspective, what incentive do white people have to reverse a systemic system that we've probably lived in for 400 years in this country?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's such an important question because the truth is that this is a system that does benefit me. I'm given the benefit of the doubt. I'm seen as sometimes a neutral perspective on race, which is crazy. None of us are neutral, right, on these kinds of things. And so you understand that there's good reason for folks not to want to surrender that. But there's all sorts of harms and consequences for white folks in a racist society. Not only the ills of segregation and how little, as my answer to the other question revealed, right? We actually get to know and learn about the world. To have false attribution that I am only successful because of my hard work, it's better to know how things really work. It's better to be in a social system that actually impacts. So like if you take even policy suggestions or ways that this can show up in institutions, it's not as though any support to ameliorate this. The example in my mind, and I'm not trying to push this as like a political narrative, think of it what you will, but like let's say we had universal health care. That's not gonna hurt me. It's gonna help make it so that folks don't experience extra barriers to their well-being, to their financial health, to their mental and emotional health, so that we can all just be in this world a little bit better. So there's actually not a lot to lose that I think we have any good reason to keep. And so I think we have to motivate folks out of that inaction by seeing how it does negatively impact us, and those are just a few ways. I would love for you all to be talking about more of those ways, but not centering only on the experiences and needs of white folks in the room. But like having that conversation is definitely a potential inroad if you're not already just upsetting people. And I think there are rising numbers. It's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out both politically and with time of folks who are coming to a different kind of awareness about this than maybe even we had a decade ago. And where's that going to land and where's that going to take us? Because I think fewer folks are totally ignorant to this anymore, and a lot of people are getting passionate about this work. But understanding that fighting racism does not only benefit folks of color, it benefits all of us.
So we have time for only 2 more questions. I see one here and I see one right behind.
Where at?
Am I next? Am I next? Yeah. Oh, okay. So my question is about,
Thank you.
sorry.
The lights are in my face, so I see you all, but I don't see you well. Thanks.
Gotcha. So my question is about kind of the motivation for folks to have, these biases, prejudice, institutional and individual. How much does fear come up in why people have created these systems or have these institutions or have developed over time these biases outside of just being taught them and being kind of modeled for them growing up? I think you talked about the lines and the kind of the flag from the Southern flag, and then you had the schools and the neighborhoods. And I'm just wondering, has fear ever come up in your research as one of those things? Just don't know, just don't understand. Because like you said, racial is not the only, you got a lot of different types of oppression. So how often or do you ever see fear come up?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and I think it reflects an insight that you already have, that's absolutely part of it. It just varies by context, by moment, by political or other kind of project that folks are working on at any given time. I mean, I can tell you for sure fear was really salient with the Tea Party folks, and there's a pretty clear mapping from that onto some of the Trump supporters today. Certainly not all of them, right? But a lot of that discourse is around, fear about national security, fear about, I was interviewing some folks here in Illinois who were Tea Party organizers living in a very rural area. We're sitting at their table on their farm in very rural Illinois, and they're talking about how worried they are about their kids going to be able to afford a decent education and get a decent job. The lens they have on that is demonstrably untrue, right? That immigrants and other folks of color are taking away those opportunities, and you can have those conversations, but that's rooted in wanting a different kind of society. And so it's interesting because fear also can provide us with potential coalition if racism weren't such a pervasive variable or a barrier, right? That those racialized fears are absolutely central to the way that we think about this, but I don't think they're the only thing that's going on either. But they definitely show up. And in the sort of progressive, diverse communities, it was fear of crime, and that was always talked about in racialized ways, right, and that kind of thing. So fear is always a part of it. Yeah.
So we're only going to take one more question. However, Dr. Burke is welcoming questions today if you send her an email.
Yeah.
Her email is listed up there.
How old were you when you first decided to speak out about it, and what was your first way of speaking about it? Like, how were you comfortable? How did you address coming out and speaking about it?
I was really bad at it at first. I'm still really bad at it sometimes. I guess I was in my junior year of college. I was very interested in social justice issues, and I was active in a primarily class-driven movement at the time, kind of working on kind of awareness around like sweatshops and other labor sorts of things. And we said, well, why aren't the students of color helping us on this? Don't they know that their lives are about class? So it was ignorant. It was made all sorts of assumptions. It was really unfair. It's like, so bad at it at first. My family also likes to talk about, they call it Meghan the dark years, right? So like we'd be at like Thanksgiving dinner and I'm like, why aren't we talking about genocide of Native Americans and that we are on stolen land, right? And they're just like, can we just eat, right? So, and I think too often folks run away at that point, or they get embarrassed, or they get nervous, or they don't hear the feedback sometimes that we need to hear in order to do this more effectively. But I think it's always a growth process. Yeah, thank you. And I apologize that I can't stay with you for the rest of the summit. I have other commitments on my campus, but just as Dr. Elise said, I warmly welcome you to be in touch with me. I'll leave some of my business cards out by where the book flyers and stuff are too. I'm just up the road. And I wish you all the luck I commend you for having the hard conversations and doing the action planning, trying to do the work that's necessary at this summit. Thank you again.
Thank you so very much.